Well, the Traitor King sort of came out of the Mountbatten book. Edward VIII had been Mountbatten's best man. And so I'd read the books on the Edward VIII, and I'd always never really bought into the abdication story, that this was a great love affair. And as I read more about it, I began to feel that there was an interesting story here, but telling the story after the abdication. Everything seemed to stop as if his life stopped then. And so I just began to do some research and reading into that period from 36 till his death 36 years later in 72. And again, it was a book about a relationship, which appeared to be one thing, but in reality, I suspect it was something else. And I'd never really bought into the argument that he was some innocent dupe of the Nazis. It just didn't make sense to me. So it's just another case of perhaps looking at the historical narrative and thinking there might be other explanations.
So, can you just give us a rundown of the lead up to the abdication as you tell it in your book?
The story basically is that Edward had always had these much older mistresses, they're sort of substitute mother figures. And Wallis, he met in the early 30s. She, I think, enjoyed just being the mistress of the king, being in his social circles. I think she was actually quite happy with her husband, Ernest Simpson. But he got rather infatuated with her. And this became a bit of a crisis when he became king in January 1936 and began basically to insist that she become his wife. And it's not something she wanted. I think she was very happy to be on the periphery of his, or part of his circle, but not to be his wife. And it became a sort of a constitutional crisis because clearly, as the supreme governor of the Church of England, he couldn't marry a woman who had been divorced. He had two husbands, including one that was living. And then this is where my sort of theory comes into play. The government, who were never particularly keen on him as becoming the king, they were worried about his Nazi sympathies, they were worried about his commitment to the job, used Wallis as a way of basically maneuvering him off the throne. And they did that by basically forcing him into a corner, getting the Dominions to sort of give their views, and marginalizing him in some ways. And he was sort of forced into making a decision, not a decision that I think there were some other options, but he was faced into this decision of choose the woman or the job. And he chose the woman. Even though she said, look, this is wrong, I will disappear. And there were suggestions that there could be a morganatic marriage, that she didn't need to be queen, that he could have kept her as a mistress, or indeed they could have done something after the coronation. So suddenly there was this crisis which grew in the course of 1936, not really reported in the British papers, but some of it was beginning to seep back, with basically Baldwin and others, again, supported very much by the church, by the Dominions, and by some of his advisors, particularly Tommy Lascelles, his private secretary, basically using Wallis as a device to get him out of the way.
And can you give us an idea of why they were so concerned about him pre the abdication? So, what was it about Wallace Simpson and him previous to that that gave them such concern?
Well, I think there were some concerns that Wallis Simpson was herself sympathetic to the Nazis. She had close links to Ribbentrop. And actually, that was confirmed to me in a talk I gave where the grandson of Ribbentrop's chauffeur came up to me and talked about how often his grandfather would drive Wallis to Ribbentrop's house. So there was the concerns about Wallis's Nazi links. There were concerns about his own sympathies towards Nazi Germany. He'd tried to interfere in the Anglo-German naval agreement in 1935. He was clearly being played by the Germans, by cousins like Prince Philip of Hesse. She was actually sort of being played by a German female agent who'd moved into her apartment block in Bryanston Court. And then there were just his concerns about his commitment to the job, that he was lazy, he didn't read his brief, he was indiscreet. They just felt that he wanted to be a modernizer. I mean, there were some signs there, a little bit of Prince Harry. He wanted to be a bit of a disruptor, and people didn't feel, particularly then, that that was the way to go. So there were lots of reasons to sort of find some way of preventing him coming to the throne.
And one of the things that's brilliant about your book is how you touch on the human side of Edward and Wallis throughout. So, for example, you tell the story after the abdication where Edward goes to see the family and they're all in tears and he strolls in all jolly and jubilant. And you also tell the story that on the night that he went into his exile from the UK, he had to be carried on board because he was so drunk. What do you think that tells us about Edward, that kind of behavior around the abdication initially?
Well, I think it shows that he was quite relieved to have this pressure off him. I mean, he'd been trained to do this all his life, and he'd been very good as very charismatic Prince of Wales. But I think he began to sort of he never really grew up, and so the sense of the responsibility suddenly weighing down on him, I think, became too much for him. So you're absolutely right. We have this extraordinary moment at Royal Lodge on the night basically he leaves just before he does his broadcast and afterwards, where the family are terribly upset. Bertie is sort of coming to terms with this extraordinary change in his life. Queen Mary is trying to keep a strip up her lip. And actually, he's just got this sense of relief as if the exams are over and the holidays begun. And as you say, we have this extraordinary story of him being taken drunk to on board. I mean, he was a heavy drinker. This is a story that came from the cousin of one of the ratings. There's no reason why it should have been made up, but it's one of those stories that never appears in any of the books. So I thought it was quite an interesting sort of vignette. And of course, we have these odd moments. It's a very wet night. He gets lost. The guard has been waiting for him for ages. Um, and it is a very sad and rather sort of downbeat end to this brief reign. Here's this man going into exile, not knowing what's going to come. His wife to be is in another country. So he goes to Austria. She's in France waiting for the decree nisi and absolute to come through. And it is a poignant sort of human story. And we know that Wallis is terrified herself of being drawn into marriage with him, but she kind of feels the music stop just at the wrong point and she can't get out of it. So we have the settings for this huge, tragedy, really.
And you mentioned Tommy Lascelles there earlier. There's a brilliant quote in your book, and it's Harold Nicholson records Tommy Lascelles saying, "The king was like the child in the fairy story who was given every gift except a soul." What caused the breakdown of the relationship between Tommy Lascelles and Edward?
Well, I think the breakdown was because Tommy Lascelles was a real stickler for tradition, a very strong sense of public duty, and he didn't feel that Edward had that. Edward would continually let people down. He wasn't actually particularly kind to Lascelles, who went on to serve both George VI and Queen Elizabeth II, and was a sort of, I mean, pivotal figure in the 20th century monarchy. So, yeah, I just think that the relationship broke down, and he was pretty instrumental in persuading people that it wouldn't be a good idea if he did become king. And I think that was the problem. There was no soul to him, there was no heart to him. And you see, in some ways, the repetition of this with other members of the royal family later on, some of the problems there, the same lack of a hinterland and any sort of sensitivity.
So, Edward is abdicated. He's left the UK. He's in exile in Europe. And he's an absolutely terrible house guest, as you talk about brilliantly in the book. Can you just give us some ideas, firstly, of the people he's staying with, and secondly, some examples of him being a terrible house guest?
Well, I mean, when the abdication takes place, it happens so quickly that no one's made any arrangements about what will happen when he goes into exile. And a Jewish couple, Kitty Rothschild and her husband, step into the breach and offer him the use of their house just outside Vienna. And they're incredibly hospitable. They put on special events for him at Christmas. They allow him to, run up huge phone bills, which they pay for. And he, as you say, is the guest from hell. He has very odd hours. He's playing the drums and the bagpipes in the middle of the night. He never thanks them for anything. When they give him a generous Christmas present, he gives them a signed photo. He just disappears, which she gives up in disgust, and he doesn't even get up out of bed to say goodbye and thank her. Though, fun enough, she comes to the wedding shortly afterwards. So it's just a classic example, again, of this entitlement, the sense that everyone should revolve around what he wants and what he wants to do. And even some of his poor courtiers who accompany him into exile end up having to pick up the bills. He first of all sends the bills to the delegation, and then I think one of the equerries kind of picks up the bill. So it's a very strange life. He's absolutely fixated on talking to Wallis every night. The financial settlement. This is where the relationship with Bertie really breaks down, because Bertie realizes that actually he's been siphoning quite a lot of money off from the duchies, the Duchy of Lancaster and Cornwall, and he's actually doesn't really need this £25,000 annuity each year. And so it'd be embarrassing to go to Parliament and ask for this money on the civil list. He plays hardball in terms of getting rid of his stake in Balmoral and Sandringham. And this is where a lot of the unpleasantness comes in. And it's generated by Edward VIII. Bertie is a much more emollient sort of figure, but it's his wife, Elizabeth, who's pretty tough. And this is when you begin to see, in some ways, the making of Bertie, shaped very much by the Queen Mum.
So there's a brilliant quote in your book, and it's Wallis Simpson talking about waking up the day after she married Edward. Can you just talk about that?
Yes, I mean the wedding itself is a rather sort of sad affair. None of his family are allowed to will attend. Wallis isn't given her HRH, which is would come automatically being married to him. Mountbatten isn't allowed to be his best man. There are only about a dozen people there, and they wouldn't, for example, the king wouldn't allow a Church of England minister to marry them, though there's a man from Darlington, the Reverend Robert Jardine, who comes down and does it, and then kind of exploits that later on in life. And Barbara Metcalfe, who's one of the people there, who's the wife of Fruity Metcalfe, who's his ADC, produced a really interesting diary. And she is a very good eyewitness to what's going on at the ceremony. She feels that Wallis is very hard. She doesn't seem to love this man who's absolutely obsessed with her. And then there's this moment when, in some ways, everything's over and they kind of wake up to the reality of what's happened. And this is when Wallis comes they have separate rooms, comes to his room and realizes his whole life has been sort of ordered for him and he's had the resources of the whole of the royal household organizing him. And now she's responsible for him and entertaining him and basically keeping him out of mischief. And I think she suddenly realizes the responsibilities she has, not just in some ways domestically, but also in terms of this broader role.
And you touched on the finances there, and it's a really interesting part of the whole book, really. There's this scene throughout where really the thesis is that his exile was a financial exile as much as a political or a royal one. And that one of the reasons he didn't want to come back to England was because he'd have to pay taxes. So firstly, can you just talk about the hidden money? He had a huge amount that he didn't talk about. And can you just also talk about the financial negotiations that were ongoing after the abdication and the levers he tried to pull to get what he wanted?
Yes, well, I mean, the negotiations went on for about a year while they settled things. He had made lots of money and saved lots of money. He was not a poor man. He always pretended to be poor. He was a bit of a skinflint. He didn't like paying for anything, but actually liked accumulating money. One of the concerns was that he'd given, for example, family jewelry to Wallis, that he had given her quite large sums of money even before they got married. And so that was one of the worries because they didn't think this marriage would last. It was one of the reasons they didn't make her HRH. And as I said, he played hardball with them in terms of coming to some sort of settlement. He knew that he was in quite a strong position. He wasn't entirely honest about his finances. I mean, shades of Prince Andrew again, and they're slightly in the dark. But you're absolutely right. They did use the financial pressure. I mean, they didn't want him anywhere near Bertie to give him space to sort of develop and not have his older brother, who they thought was more charismatic, breathing down his neck. There were concerns that there may be a focus for the Mosleyites and for the fascists around Edward because of his sympathies. And they were very keen to sort of make sure that he couldn't be there for them to coalesce around. But because he was so mean, he never liked paying tax. And one of the things with the French was that they didn't insist he pay tax. In fact, paid a lot of his expenses. They were very good to him. And so sometimes someone once asked me, why did the French behave so well to him? I mean, later on, they gave him the use of a very impressive house that had been leased to Charles de Gaulle and others at pretty peppercorn rent. And that partly, I think, was just to annoy the British. It was a way of of perhaps cooking a snoot at the British and showing the French, knew how to behave. But he always, for example, got petrol under allowances, particularly after the war. During the war, as a member of the armed forces, he was able to get all sorts of benefits in terms of food and supplies. And he took advantage of all that. And one of the real concerns that he had about certain places was he would have to pay tax. And so it was a very good way of keeping him very much in America. There were plans at times for him to divide his time between America and France, which he did eventually. Initially, he spent part of the time in the south of France in a house now owned by Roman Abramovich and part in a house in Paris. Later on, he would spend after the war part of his time in Paris and part of the time in New York. Or staying with people. He loved to stay with people because, again, of course, he was treated well and didn't have to pick up any bills.
And To what extent do you think Edward was seduced by the Nazis? And to what extent do you think the Nazis were seduced by Edward?
Well, I think the Nazis played Edward. They could see that he was sympathetic. A lot of it was down to his desire that there shouldn't be another world war, his belief that this should never happen again. I think he felt a strong bond with Germanic peoples. He spoke good German. He was very drawn to German culture, I mean, German food. He used to dress up in lederhosen. And so they took advantage of this. He was close to cousins like Prince Philip of Hesse and another man, Saxe-Coburg. And so the Germans used these people who were Nazis to kind of get in with Edward. I mean, they also had the advantage that Wallis was quite sympathetic too. And I think it went beyond that, though. I mean, we have him stories and all evidence with sources of him betraying secrets during the war to the Nazis. Sometimes it was leaks from a butler, but a lot of it was deliberate. There's the fact that he made a trip to Germany in the autumn of 1937 after he got married, which he knew would be embarrassing to his brother. Again, shades of Harry and William. And he can't have been unaware at this stage of what the Nazi regime was like. He was pretty anti-Semitic and he remained anti-Semitic even after the war when everyone knew about the concentration camps. And he was very keen when he went as governor of the Bahamas to basically keep Americans out of the war. He did believe that the Germans and the British could come to some accommodation, and the important threat was communism, and that they could turn and face them together, deal with the Russians together. So, in some ways, he proved to be right. I mean, that we ended up with the Russians taking over half of Europe, the end of the British Empire, bills that couldn't be paid until the present century. So, in some ways, some of these appeasers and of course, there were appeasers in the government. I mean, Lord Halifax, Rao Butler, and others that he was aware of. So that he knew that there was some political support here. He actually came back during the Phony War and tried to get people to sort of come together. And so, and of course, we had the famous episode with the plot in the summer of 1940 when he's in Portugal and the Germans approach him and basically try and entice him to go off to Switzerland for a sum of money. And then, should the Germans successfully invade Britain, he would be brought back as a puppet leader. And I think he did think this would happen. And in some ways, his views had changed. He did feel that perhaps this was a way of bigging himself up with Wallis and giving her a role. I think he felt that having given up the throne, he had let her down. So there's a lot of evidence, and even throughout the war, his links with the Nazi regime continued, even in, for example, places like New York. So I don't think there's any doubt that he was sympathetic, that he was surrounded by German agents, a man called Axel Wenner-Gren, a man called Charles Bedaux, and others. And he was warned about them and ignored, by the intelligence services, both British and American, and he continued to associate with them. I think not just because they could entertain him on lavish boats, but because he wanted to keep in contact with them. He saw it very much as business. There were a lot of people in the States who could see that war wouldn't be good, but for them, particularly people like General Motors, who had big investments in Germany, like Charles Bedaux had, and wanted to come to some accommodation with them.
Um, and let's talk about that then. So another kind of theme from the book is that Edward's dodgy mates are a feature, not a bug. What do you think attracted him to such nefarious characters?
Well, again, we see these parallels with Andrew and Epstein. Here are people who can give him contacts, can pay bills, and I think there was a certain element of idealism with some of these people. Charles Bedaux did think about sort of world peace. Axel Wenner-Gren, again, had been part of this world sort of peace campaign before the war. I think a little bit of a front for their sort of pro-German activities. But he believed in the Führerprinzip. He liked these people. People like Axel Wenner-Gren had a nice big boat that had been owned by Howard Hughes that he could borrow. So they made life much more comfortable for him. Charles Bedaux lent him his castle to get married in the summer of 1937. Everything was a bit transactional, and so these people supported him financially. He felt that he was on the same wavelength with them politically. So even though he was warned against them, he continued to associate with them.
And you talked there about his kind of desire for peace, and you mentioned in the book that he was planning to tour the country and to campaign for peace. until Walter Monckton reminded him about income tax, at which point his face blanched and he declared the whole thing off. So clearly the money's playing a role there more than his desire for peace.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think was very clever with Monckton. He kind of got the measure of the man. I mean, Monckton is one of those interesting figures who is used by Churchill and others to persuade Edward to do certain things. For example, to go to the Bahamas as governor instead of being court-martialed, which is what Churchill threatened. But he'd been a great supporter of his during the abdication. And he had the trust, I think, of both Churchill and of Edward. So he was a very good intermediary and he understood Edward and what made him tick.
There's a persistent blackmailer in your book who kind of follows Edward around France, despite being expelled from France. They get back in. And you also mentioned the Duke's brother, the Duke of Kent, was blackmailed. How common was this kind of thing for the British royal family in the 19th and 20th century?
Well, I suspect quite a lot of blackmailing stories we just never know about. But this was a woman, this only comes from a diary by a friend of Wallis called Constance Coolidge. And she talks about this woman, Madame Moroni, who is acting for someone else who has basically incriminating information about Edward and a relationship with Prince Philip of Hesse, which could be political, it could be sexual. And so I mean, so much of this stuff has been destroyed. Clearly, we don't have any of the French police papers, which must have existed. There must have been reports from Edward's detectives, for example, which have disappeared. I think one of the sad things when I researched this book was to discover how much had been destroyed. That when material, for example, on MI5 surveillance of Wallis was released in 2005, they only released one representative file, thinking the others didn't matter. So we just get these little pinpricks of insight. But Madame Moroni, clearly, there were several meetings there. She turned out to be a little bit of a nutter, and I think was expelled from France. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there were stories that the Duke of Kent had been blackmailed because of his homosexuality. There was a man called Mendel, who was a friend of Edward's in Paris, who perhaps had been knighted on the strength of being able to get rid of some letters that might be incriminating. So the problem is that so much of the stuff has just vanished, and so we just don't know the full picture. But I suspect there was quite a lot of blackmail going on, particularly with characters like Edward and the Duke of Kent, who did have secrets.
And can you talk about the relationship between Churchill and Edward? Because he was obviously a great supporter of him before and during the abdication. How did that relationship develop during and after the war?
Well, the relationship was strong before the war. Churchill was the sort of ran the King's party. I think he then became very disillusioned with him. I mean, at one point he said, "Our cock won't fight." He felt that he could have put up a more of a fight. I think when he got involved with the financial negotiations in 36, 37, he realized that Edward wasn't perhaps the straightest character. And I think he became rather disillusioned. The more he discovered about his sympathies for the Nazis, that clearly got worse. Edward became a complete pain during that phony war and afterwards because he wasn't doing the things he was supposed to do. He was betraying secrets. He at one point had to be rescued by a destroyer and brought back because he wouldn't be flown back after war broke out. There was plotting with Beaverbrook in the spring of 1940. So Churchill, I think, got pretty fed up. This is when he threatened him with court-martial. And I think that relationship never fully recovered. There were times after the war where Churchill did his best to protect Edward, particularly with the release of some captured German documents, which were pretty incriminating about his Nazi links. And clearly, for the sake of the monarchy, the sake of the country, Churchill colluded with Eisenhower to destroy some material and certainly to suppress it for many years and to minimize its seriousness. But there were odd moments where they did meet. I think they went on a cruise at one point together, or Churchill certainly came out and stayed with Edward in the south of France at one point. So I think that they came to some sort of accommodation. But I don't think Churchill had any illusions about the sort of person he was dealing with.
Can you talk about the infiltration of the Duke of Windsor's staff with spies?
Yes. I mean, I think the interesting thing is that he took on particularly a butler, James Hale, who'd worked for Charles Bedaux. And the suspicion is that James Hale was certainly overhearing things and then reporting them back to the Germans. There's a sort of trail back from stuff that the Duke said through the German ambassador in, I think it was Luxembourg, and then back to Germany. And so I think Bedaux had very cleverly planted various people in the household that who could report back to the various German embassies. But he was pretty indiscreet. He didn't hide his views. This is after the war had broken out. People were bombing London. And even then, he was telling the Germans, if you want to subjugate Britain, the best way to do it is to bomb London. And even seemed prepared to have his brother bombed at Buckingham Palace. I mean, there are even suggestions that he may have alerted them to, for example, where the king was living in Buckingham Palace. Um, but a lot of the stuff it's very difficult to prove.
And can you talk about some specific examples where the Duke's or Bedaux's leaks had a material effect on the war? So, for example, in France and in exposing weak areas.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were several bits of evidence. There's a bit, for example, where the American ambassador tells during the war that, or I think, or just before the war, perhaps, that basically the codes of the Italians and Germans can be read, and that the Mussolini is being given arms by the Germans. And that story gets back to various people, and the only way it could have been leaked is from the Duke. I think the most important is the war plans of the Germans. He sees these plans. He's given the job as liaison officer to the French army. He goes and inspects a lot of the defenses. And I mean, it is hard to believe that the Germans hadn't worked some of this stuff out themselves. But he was able to pass on information. It's clear from we've seen these captured German documents, which is the diplomatic traffic from the German embassies, particularly in places like Paris and elsewhere, showing that he had given the details of these defenses to Germans. And of course, they rearranged their invasion. They came around the side of the Maginot Line, and they knew where the vulnerabilities were and clearly where they shouldn't be attacking. So I think he has quite a lot of blood on his hands.
So, one of the intelligence reports that you quote in the book talks about Wallis's desperation to be queen. Do you think she was disappointed when he abdicated?
Yes, I think there was a change of view. I mean, I think he didn't want the job. I think then he kind of felt, well, actually, I do want this job. I kind of feel I've let her down. She kind of, I think she was quite an ambitious woman, and I don't think she would have been a great queen. I think he did have the sense that he needed to big himself up in her eyes by becoming king. That he'd perhaps given in too easily, and maybe he'd worked out how he'd been outmaneuvered, and this was perhaps his way of getting back. But there was always this tension with his brother. Bertie did step up to the mark, but it was a pretty slow start. He was quite unpopular. It's now emerging that George VI and his wife were not as popular as everyone thought. There was quite a lot of propaganda was pumped out, and he still had his stammer. He still hadn't. I mean, Churchill. He didn't have a terrific relationship with Churchill. I mean, that clearly got better. So yeah, I mean, he was always going to be a threat in these early days.
Parts of the book read like a thriller, and particularly the parts in Portugal. Can you just talk about how close the Duke and Duchess of Windsor came to being kidnapped? And also talk about the fact that at one point there were orders to shoot them from the British government if they were kidnapped. So can you just take us through that extraordinary part of the book?
Yeah, I mean, we have this moment where basically Edward abandons his post in Paris as the Germans begin to invade. He goes down to the south of France. They escape to Spain and on to Portugal, which was the sort of route to come back to Britain. And Lisbon is a great sort of nest of spies and people traveling. And for various reasons, he kind of hangs out in Lisbon, and there's a delay in bringing him back. Partly he plays for time. He wants his wife to be recognized and her to be made HRH, and he wants to go and stay at Royal Lodge. And he insists that he wants his Batman to be let off military service and to serve him. I mean, these could be just delaying tactics, or it could just be him being petulant. But the result is he kind of hangs around Portugal for several weeks, and the Germans realize that it's a time when they can actually approach him and see if they can be persuaded with payment of money and his ego to be this puppet king. And he does entertain them. We know that from the Portuguese secret files. We know that from private files that we've seen or I've seen of diplomats at the time. And indeed, some of the Churchill correspondence, which has been sitting in Churchill College archives, and no one seems to have really noticed it. But clearly, there was a lot going on during that summer of 1940. Someone who's a historian said to me, "This is the most important bit of recent history in which we know so little because so much was not put down on paper or the material was destroyed." But there were clearly peace negotiations going on. We have the famous halt when the British Expeditionary Force could have actually been captured before they got to Dunkirk, and the British were allowed to escape. And there are suspicions that this was all around peace negotiations that are going on at the same time, which we know were going on through the Vatican, through Switzerland, and through Sweden, and with people like Rab Butler and the Swedish minister Pritz. So there is some suggestion that everyone was slightly seeing how things played out in this summer of 1940, or particularly July. You're absolutely right. There is a moment where the Germans decide they send a man called Schellenberg, who's a sort of high-flying German lawyer and SS man, to basically orchestrate this plot, Operation Willi. And the plan is that they will basically entice him onto a sort of hunting weekend in Spain, and they will just capture him and whisk him off to Switzerland. And there are all sorts of games being played with British intelligence, monitoring what's going on. And there is, as you say, this extraordinary story with a young intelligence officer who later becomes professor of Spanish at Oxford, who is delegated to keep an eye on him with the instructions that if they do whisk him away, he is to basically create an accident and Edward VIII is basically killed by his own side, which is an extraordinary story. And it came to me partly from this man's memoirs and the man writing his biography, and then also after a talk by members of his family who turned up and confirmed the story. So yeah, another little element to that strange behavior in July 1940, where he's in and out of the German embassy. He's being followed by all sorts of people. We have the Portuguese Secret Service giving very extensive surveillance notes of following him, who he's seeing, what he's doing, what he's talking about. So it was a close call.
Can you talk about some of the ways that the British government used army rank to control Edward, and also lead into how that helped them persuade him to go to the Bahamas?
Well, the Duke had the honorary position as a king, I think, of vice of field marshal, and in order for him to serve as a liaison officer for the French Second Army and to report to a major general, he was basically demoted. And they used the fact that he'd been demoted, he was only a major general, that he couldn't, for example, kind of upstage his younger brothers, like the Duke of Gloucester, who were also serving. And so by using the fact that he had this lower rank, they were able to kind of control him a bit. And it was particularly obvious when Churchill, as Prime Minister, basically threatened him with court-martial under military law. So he saw him as a serving officer reporting to him. So there was a complete change there in terms of I suppose how the pecking order, and I think he found that quite hard to accept. But yes, there were lots of ways that they kind of brought him into play. But I think one of the things I found really surprising was just the way that the Germans cooperated with him. So, for example, they clearly had occupied France. He was in Spain and Portugal, but the Germans were, for example, allowed his maid to go back and collect belongings from the house in Paris, and a swimsuit, famous Nile green swimsuit, and extraordinary things that clearly, given the two countries at war, wouldn't have been allowed unless they were very keen to keep him on side.
Tell us about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor's time in the Bahamas. And can you also introduce us to some of these characters in a bit more detail? So you've already mentioned Wenner-Gren there. Also talk about Sir Harry Oakes, and give us an idea of what their time in the Bahamas was like and what kind of trouble they got up to there.
Well, eventually the Duke and Duchess go off in August 1940 to the Bahamas. They're faced with this choice of the court martial or governor of the Bahamas. And this is to get him out of the way. I mean, they see it as being like sent to Elburz and Tolina. And I think one of the extraordinary things is even on their way to the Bahamas, they go via Bermuda, they're actually sending telegrams back to one of their contacts in a man called Dos Santos in Lisbon, saying that if an opportunity arises for us to sort of serve the Germans again, we're here ready and waiting. And they go to the Bahamas, and actually in some ways that's the making of Wallis. She gets involved in a lot of the charity work there. She kind of accepts the situation. He doesn't. He's very lazy. He wants to go and play golf. He, as you say, gets involved with very wealthy people out there. A Swedish industrialist, the founder of Electrolux, called Axel Wenner-Gren, who is suspected of being a German spy, that his big Shangri-La estate has got deep pens to allow submarines to be refueled, because there's a big problem in the Caribbean of German submarines basically destroying Allied shipping, that they can't understand how that's happening. And then this other man, Harry Oakes, who's, I think, the richest man in the Bahamas, and a man called Harold Christie. And the Duke gets involved in business relationships with both Harold Christie, who's a sort of property developer, and Harry Oakes. And what seems to emerge is that Harry Oakes is cheated by Harold Christie with basically building work at the airport. One of the things that happens during the war is the Bahamas is developed as a naval and airline base and lots of American troops come. Anyway, part of that redevelopment, Christie and Oakes are involved. But the Duke has also got involved with some pretty shady business deals, dealing with a Nazi bank, the Banco Continental, with money that's going out to Mexico. He's kind of operating on the black market, which is what he does later in life after the war. But he's also basically, I think, stashing monies away should, let's say, Britain and Germany win the war. And we have this famous murder in July 1943, where Harry Oakes is found murdered in his bed. There's a huge cover-up. The Duke is informed about it. He basically doesn't go to the obvious authorities like the RAF police or Scotland Yard or even the FBI in New York. He brings in two cricket cops from Miami who've been his sort of bodyguards when he's been going across the states. And they basically frame an innocent man, the son-in-law of Harry Oakes, a man called Alfred de Marigny, of the murder. And they do that by planting his fingerprint, which they've lifted off a glass. They've given him a glass of water to drink, onto the screen in the murder scene. There are lots of questions, for example, about Harold Christie's role. Harold Christie had stayed the night before. He was the man who found the body. Doesn't seem to have heard anything about the attack. He's cited actually driving through the middle of Nassau the night of the murder, which he denies. So the big questions about Harold Christie and his role, and de Marigny, and of course, and the Duke's role. The Duke not only brings in these crooked cops, but he has a news blackout, and he then disappears during the course of the trial, basically keeping out of the way. And de Marigny almost hangs, and it's only because of a very good defense team who's actually worked out what's happened with this planted evidence that de Marigny gets off. And de Marigny is quickly expelled from the island. They just don't want him around talking. And the Duke, for example, has sent the British chief of police away. He's actually posted him to another island, Trinidad. There's a real sign of a cover-up here. It's one of the great mysteries, the unexplained murder of Harry Oakes. I mean, I think most people now feel that Harold Christie was involved, and various, perhaps, underworld figures were brought in to carry out the act. And it's all to do with these business activities and double-crossing Harry Oakes. Harry Oakes had discovered what was going on and was threatening to expose Christie. But there have been Scotland Yard examinations and FBI examinations. All those papers are still closed now, still 80 years after the event. And so one has to wonder what exactly went on. And I think that a lot of that is to protect the role of the Duke of Windsor, who clearly did not behave in the way he should have done. He continues to serve as governor until almost the end of the war. I mean, there's something called the second abdication, where basically he leaves slightly early. He's got a bit fed up, too many mosquitoes, it's a bit too humid, and he wants to get back into the action. But he's got some achievements there. I think particularly Wallis, he did a lot of good work for charities out there, particularly the position of the population. I think he was very much under the control of what was called the Bay Street Boys, who were a group of local businessmen who basically ran the show politically. And I think he realized that he wasn't going to be able to get through some reforms that he wanted. So it's a slightly mixed picture, but at the end of the war, he basically goes off to the States. He's still lobbying for some sort of government position, But I think people by this stage have these German documents, which are the diplomatic traffic before the war and during the war, have now been picked up by the Americans. They're shared with senior British officials. And there's a realization that there's a lot of embarrassing information to come out about him that needs to be suppressed. And there's a big battle between the British establishment and American historians about this. Eventually, the American historians who actually have the material, so they're in quite a strong position, say that we will delay publication of these papers, some of which we need for the Nuremberg trials, but they will be published. And some of this material is published in the late 1950s. It's all slightly minimized by the British authorities. He was sort of tricked by the Nazis. He, didn't know what he was doing. But that's quite embarrassing stuff. And Churchill is very much involved in that cover-up.
And how much do you think is still being hidden by the Royal Archives or indeed government archives?
Oh, I think there's a lot of stuff. I mean, it may be not just hidden, it may have been destroyed. So we know there are many more German telegrams of this captured German documents that are missing. There's a meeting he had with Hitler in 1937, which we think would have been minuted, but there's no material. There's clearly a lot of correspondence, we think, I think a lot of historians think, between him and people like Prince Philip of the Duke of Saxe-Coburg, which have vanished. That was one of the reasons that Anthony Blunt was sent at the end of the war on this mission to hoover up this material that could be embarrassing. I think there's concerns that other members of the royal family may well have had contact with people like Philip of Hesse, people like Queen Mary. So we'll just never know if it's in the Royal Archives or not. Certainly, Blunt brought some material back. I've looked, I was told that I was the first to look at many of the papers relating to Edward VIII when I did my research for the book. I'm not sure I saw everything, but I did see a lot of stuff which no one had ever seen before, showing that, for example, George VI was monitoring his brother and that was seeing some of these German telegrams and clearly had no illusions about what his sympathies were, despite what the public position was. One of the things that was slightly odd was that they would tell me I can't come in for another week or 2 weeks because they want to just check the papers. And the reason you check papers is to take some stuff out. If you had no concerns, you would have just given me the file. So I think that there was a bit of censorship there. But yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more still to come out. And my worry was that when I did research, for example, in American archives and looked at that Blunt trip through the files of the old monuments men, so that they paint a completely different picture to the picture in some of the stuff in the Royal Archives. And there's a famous letter from Owen Morshead, who was the librarian to the king, with his instructions to Blunt, and the two of them went out on this trip together in his report, which don't ring true to me. They don't tally with the stuff I've seen in the American archives. And I have a suspicion that there's actually false material being placed into, for example, the Royal Archives for people to find. And this is not an unusual thing with archives. I mean, we're always worried about archives being taken out, but actually there was a famous case with father and son, Peter and Martin Allen, where they actually put false documentation into the National Archives and then used that to back up their theories about Nazi collaboration. So you search when you come out, but always search when you go in.
Let's have a look at the relationship between Edward and Wallis. So I'd like to just start with asking about the Chinese dossier. And there's some discussion as to whether or not it even exists, but there's also evidence in your book that Queen Mary had seen it and that it had been shown to the royal family. Can you just give us an idea of what is the Chinese dossier? What do we think's in it? And what effect did it have on the British government's assessment of Wallis?
Well, the China dossier was a basic collection of intelligence reports, mainly on her time in China, where she had married her first husband, and where there were suggestions that, for example, she had been a sort of geisha girl, but she certainly had quite a sort of racy past. Some people say it was completely invented just to discredit her. Some people say it never existed. I am of the view that it did exist. Funny enough, I had breakfast on Sunday morning with Anne Glenconner, whose father had seen it, and I said, "Did you talk about it?" And she believed in the China dossier that it existed. So I think it did exist. Whether it was genuine or fabricated to as I say, to discredit Wallis, I think is unclear. I mean, there's been a book by Paul French recently looking at Wallis's time in China, and he comes to the conclusion there was no China dossier and she led a pretty innocent life when she was out there. We do know that many of the files on Wallis were destroyed in 2005. Some were released, the famous Metropolitan Police file 1035, which talks about her affair with Guy Trundle. But I was told by the special branch man who did the vetting that a lot of files were destroyed. They just kept this one representative file. So that would have been an obvious time for the China dossier to be destroyed. But there are plenty of references. I think Churchill talks about seeing it at one point. There's a man called Kenneth de Courcy who talks about seeing it. So there's quite a lot of evidence that it existed, but whether it was genuine or not, I think is the question.
In your book, you have a quote from Nicky Haslam, and he suggested that Queen Mary's influence left her descendants sexually and emotionally fucked up. Do you think there's any truth in that and might have affected Edward's behaviour?
Yes, I think there is a lot of truth in that. I mean, I think both Mary and King George were quite distant and harsh parents. And she was pretty emotionally negligent. I mean, George V was a bit of a bully. I think that's one of the reasons that George VI had his stammer. And a lot of them didn't grow up. I mean, both Edward and indeed, you could say later, people like Prince Andrew are sort of man-childs. I mean, they have never really got beyond, they're not very sophisticated, not very bright, and they kind of regress. And I think that's certainly true. There's certainly stories from members of his own staff about his rather strange sexual peccadillos. I mean, Mountbatten himself liked to get dressed up as a baby and was drawn to young children. And there were signs of a sort of sadomasochistic relationship, for example, between Wallis and Edward, that he got sexual satisfaction from being beaten. Certainly their relationship, the marital relationship, was one of a sort of, she was the dominant one in the relationship and he kind of looked up to her. And that was true of a lot of the relationships with women. And if you look at the correspondence with, for example, with Mrs. Frida Dudley Ward, who was one of his early mistresses, it's all been baby talk. So yeah, I think they were messed up. And certainly Nicky Haslam talks about the bisexuality of not just the Duke of Kent, but also of the Duke of Windsor. There are references, I think, to the Duke of Gloucester liking to be dressed up in baby clothes as well. So there were some very strange sexual things going on with those boys.
So you quote a couple of people in the book talking about Wallis Simpson. So, for example, one person calls her cold, mean-spirited, a sadist, and a bully. And Philip Ziegler writes that she was harsh, dominating, and often abominably rude. She treated the king at best like a child and at worst with contempt. You also talk in the book about Edward saying that he needed cruelty. So to what extent was her behaviour almost even a form of kindness or a form of role play? Give us an idea of what you think about that.
Yes, I mean, I think there could be an element of role play in it. I mean, I think she was quite a hard person. I mean, quite ambitious, quite cold. I mean, she'd lost her father when she was very young. She was searching herself for financial security because she'd been brought up in this rather sort of just supported by the kindness of her relations. And her mother had to open a boarding house, a rather genteel boarding house to survive. So she wanted emotional and I think economic security, which of course certainly provided the financial security. Emotional security, it was a slightly different relationship, but she'd had a bad marriage with her first husband, who was a bully and a drunk and beat her up. Ernest Simpson, actually, I think there was a good relationship there. She continued to remain in touch with him. I think she was sad about the divorce. I mean, the irony is that he had actually fallen in love with her best friend, someone called Mary Raftery, and actually was quite happy to get divorced. He fell into he did what was asked of him. He went off to Bray and was caught in bed with Mary Raftery, and that allowed the divorce to go through. And she was the innocent party. And then sadly, Mary Raftery died in childbirth. The son actually is still alive. Became, I think, an Israeli sort of special forces person, slightly strangely. But yes, I think there was a certain amount of role play there. I mean, there are plenty of people. I mean, some biographers of Wallis present her as this very attractive, warm, hospitable woman. It's not the picture I got. It's not the picture, for example, the people, the staff and the ghostwriters of the books and anything saw. So it's not a picture I recognize, but there are some people, I think perhaps with their own agenda, who don't like this idea of a woman actually being a pretty nasty piece of work. But some of it may be role play. I think she got a bit fed up with his sort of wanting to be dominated and a bit bored by it. But so whether particularly the sexual stuff, I suspect was much more to please him than to please her, or really part of her natural character.
Yeah, I mean, there's another striking quote in the book, and it's where Edward is at a slightly messy table at the dinner table, and he says, "Darling, are you going to send me to bed without supper again?" Which is kind of telling about what we've just been talking about as
Yeah.
well.
Yes, absolutely. She did. She humiliated him. And I think she took her own frustration about her life out on him. She kind of blamed him eventually for the situation they found themselves in, and I think had a lot of regrets about it. And they led in some ways very different lives. And if you see them, watch them being interviewed, there are a couple of famous interviews, and particularly in the 60s. He has these very sad eyes. They don't look a very happy couple, and you get the feeling that she's wearing the trousers.
Yeah, he's very fidgety in them, isn't he? He's very kind of always sort of, yeah, I've seen both of those. One of them's really interesting because it was done live and the questions were pre-arranged and it was rehearsed. But actually, the interviewer asked them a question that wasn't in the rehearsal that he didn't know was coming. He asked him, "Do you think about what it would have been like to be king?" And it really, really throws them. You argue that there's a disparity between Edward's feeling for Wallis and Wallis's feelings for Edward. Can you talk about why you came to this conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I think often in marriages, it's not always a completely equal relationship. And I think that, as I say, she began to resent him. She was clearly much more independent than him. She got tired of him, particularly as he got old. He was a heavy drinker. He had very limited interests. I mean, so did she. I mean, all she wanted to do was socialize, really, and meet people, and a bit of a social climber and cafe society. But I think she was disappointed in him. So all those things came out, whereas he continued to be kind of infatuated with her, but back to this very childish mummy substitute figure. And in some ways got his kicks from being publicly humiliated by her at times. I mean, we've talked about being sent to bed without supper and stuff. I mean, she really could be quite nasty to him and to the embarrassment of people who saw this happening. And he couldn't quite see this. I mean, so there were a lot of, I think, things being played out behind the scenes. At one point, they thought they might adopt, for example, which might have changed the dynamics. But I think it just became a very empty life. And he was content with that in some ways. He played golf. He looked at his finances. They had dinner parties twice a week. And she kind of just put everything into the social life, into having a salon with people that would come there, very elaborate meals that she planned, decorating very extravagantly their houses. They both became sort of horses and sort of fashion statements. I know, for example, that I think it's the V&A have a huge collection of material of clothes owned by both of them. I mean, he had the Windsor knot. They were both, I would say, anorexic. They hardly ate. He didn't used to have lunch because he would like to play golf at lunchtime and knew that no Frenchman would be on the golf course at lunchtime. But they were very slight. I mean, I think she may have been like 7 stone and he may have been like 9 stone or less. So there were all sorts of things going on under the surface that I think people don't really realize. They were both of them very rude to their staff. They had a rapid turnover of staff, again, shades of Meghan and Fergie. They were very mean. They didn't pay their staff very well. So it was, in some ways, very difficult to like them. They were drawn to some pretty low-life characters, again, like Fergie and Andrew. And I think a lot of decent people sort of shunned them. And but his political activity, I think, had ended by the end of the Second World War. I mean, he was very worried about communism and very anti-communist. He was clearly very right-wing, and he got involved with a lot of sort of Nixon type supporters. I mean, in fact, some of the people who are suspected of having being involved in the death of John F. Kennedy, some slightly dodgy, slightly underworld businessmen. So it was a sort of rather sad, drawn out life, really, because as I say, he comes back from the Bahamas in 45 and he has almost another 30 years of life, which he really does very little with.
And let's talk about that then. So, talk about the later years of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor in Paris. Talk about their life and just take us to the end, really, of this story.
Well, I mean, the last 30 years of his life, I mean, they are living partly in France, partly in an apartment in New York at the Waldorf Astoria. They're socializing a lot. They travel a bit, staying with people, but they don't have any sort of job. They don't do any real charity work. They kind of play. I mean, they are monetizing their positions, so they promote, for example, linen and cutlery and open department stores and make a lot of money from writing books. Again, very sensitive. I mean, the two books don't always tally, though in fact there was the same ghost on both of them. One a king's story and the other The Heart has its reasons. But they were seen as very embarrassing for the royal family in the way that Spare was seen as embarrassing later on with Harry. But they made them, both books made them a lot of money. He gradually came back to Britain a bit more, as long as he wasn't with her. So again, bit shades of Meghan. They had a little country house just outside Paris where they entertained, and which I think was the only house they ever owned properly. There was a gradual sort of rapprochement with the royal family. I think the Queen realised that this couldn't go on. And I think particularly there was a point where, for example, they were invited to a ceremony for a statue to Queen Mary in the 60s. But again, they weren't allowed to stay at Buckingham Palace. They weren't invited to have lunch afterwards. So they were kept slightly at arm's length still. Then there was a point in 1972, the Queen was in Paris. She knew that the Duke was very ill, and there was an attempt there with Prince Charles and Philip to kind of mend some bridges. And he was very pleased, but he hadn't been invited, for example, to her wedding. He wasn't invited to the coronation. So he was very much kept out of the whole thing. And we then have this rather sad moment where, which I think just explains Wallis's harshness, that the line is that he died in the arms of Wallis. Well, Wallis had a bedroom only a few doors away from where he was. And I'm told by the night nurse that she never came to see him, even in those last few weeks. And actually, he died in the arms of a temporary night nurse, a woman who's still alive, rather than with Wallis. So that's again part of the myth that grew. And then we have these very sad last years of Wallis, where she has dementia. She's drinking heavily, but hardly eating. She falls into the hands of a woman called Madame Maitre Bloom, who is a lawyer that basically rips her off. Wallis is relegated to sort of one room in a corner of this fantastic their house they have in the Bois de Boulogne. But as the furniture is sold downstairs, ostensibly to pay medical bills, but I think is being creamed off by Maitre Bloom. And there's a wonderful book by Caroline Blackwood about her attempts to interview the Duchess and how she's sort of kept away by Maitre Bloom, who herself had some sort of Nazi sympathies. And eventually she dies in 1986. She is brought back. There is a ceremony at Windsor for her. The Queen attends. There are big attempts in that period from 72 to 86 to get a lot of their goods back to the royal family. So the Order of the Garter, I think an abdication table, or table for the abdication side, actually, I think actually isn't bought by the royal family, but Lord Mountbatten is dispatched there on various trips to try and inveigle jewelry and stuff back. And then she dies. The money just goes to basically AIDS charities. A lot of the pictures and furniture are sold in famous sales. Mohammed Fayed takes over the house, Bois de Boulogne, on the grounds that he will basically restore it. But he sells off, basically asset sells a lot of their material. But fortunately, a lot of that stuff does end up in the auctions. It does end up with people who do make it public. And so we have begun to get a picture of that life. But it is a rather tragic story. And it's one where I think the myths of this great love story still continue. A lot of people buy into this, and there are people who are still obsessed by the two of them and still believe it was a great love story, which I just don't think is the case.